After hearing Professor Hess, I think I hope you're as scared as I was listening to him. I think there are many topics. So I kind of want to walk us through some ideas before I kind of leave some questions open to the floor. I think the whole idea is not for me to give you answers, but perhaps actually ask you questions and see how we can think about these things together. So I thought that perhaps the best way to start is looking at technological innovation and what has happened in the last 20 years, right? So if you look at what we've seen is basically the emergence of email, internet, MP3s, Wi-Fi, cell phones, industrial robotics has been growing a lot, genomics, GPS, which now is everywhere in our cell phones, cloud computing, and social networks, right? And I think I have big data there, right? And these are kind of the technologies that have emerged in the last 20 years, which have started to make people kind of nervous, right? Nervous, especially in terms of privacy issues, private property issues, right? If you think about what happened with MP3 technology and how this basically disrupted the whole music industry, right? And basically has changed the way we treat private property of music, for example. It clearly can be very disruptive of lots of industries. But if we look at the future, things are getting even more interesting, right? We're already seeing self-driving cars. People think that that's going to be in 5 or 10 years, we will have self-driving trucks, which I recently found out that truck driving is actually one of the most common jobs in the US. So if you think about people being impacted, think about truck drivers, Uber drivers, and now Lyft drivers, taxi drivers, et cetera, right? We see the emergence of the Internet of Things. Some of us already have those things at home, right? I will show you a picture of one of those. Then we have the emergence of 3D printing, bioprinting. 3D printing is really making a huge impact on production processes. I think I forgot to somewhere put it. The distinction between production and employment, I think, is becoming ever increasing, right? If you think about bringing jobs back to America, we're bringing production back to America, but jobs may not follow, right? And if you've seen Adidas Speedcraft factory, you will just be amazed of the kind of things that they are able to do, right? Then, of course, augmented and virtual reality, which is somewhere in the other room, and I think there's a second session where I would love to go and see. Genetic engineering, nanotechnology, synthetic biology, biocomputing, right? And so all this more novel technology that we expect to appear in the future, which Dr. has spoken a while ago, especially if we think about quantum computing and biocomputing entering our prospects in the near future, well, of course, we can imagine that disruption will be wherever we're seeing it, but even in other places, right? So if you think about how technology has disrupted our society so far, right, it has changed how we find friends, how we find our mates, how we find sexual partners, how we communicate, how we get entertained. And so we can imagine that this is going to disrupt even more parts of our life, right? And of course, this new technologies brings to mind this fear of the machine, right? The whole idea that machines are going to be much smarter than we are. And I was trying to find an old 1920s movie or something like this, so think about Metropolis. But this fear has been around for a while, right? We tend to, I don't know if we are very conservative, somewhere down in our culture, in our genes, and we may think that somehow innovation and disruption is always bad, and that's why we kind of always fear the machine. And what I want to do here, in a sense, is first forget about the ultra-smart machine, right? I want to scare you with a different story. I want to scare you with the not Terminator style of machine, which perhaps is ultra-smart, much smarter than we are. It's not going to be evil in any sense, or, right, if you've seen other of the sci-fi movies, sometimes the machine actually is good, but still it kills us because we are bad for ourselves or things like that, right? We don't want to get into those issues, which are still out there. We should still be thinking about this. But I think that there are other concerns we can do this, right? So what would happen if those machines really don't become conscious and go after us with machine guns and stuff? I wanted to think a little bit, how will this affect employment, our incomes, how it will affect inequality, institutions, our well-being. And I think there's a difference between how technology is affecting the production side versus the consumption side. And I think that's where we may have to think a little bit differently on what happens. And perhaps if we try to understand this, it would be useful to look back at history, right? I was talking to someone during breakfast, and we kind of both had this idea that indeed, perhaps this is clearly is not the first time machines are taking over. And so perhaps looking a little bit back in history may give us some clues as to how things work, right? So in order to do this, I think it's useful to remind ourselves what are kind of the human abilities that machines may be trying to substitute, right? So you may think about human ability like physical abilities, like how strong you are, how fast you are, perhaps your fine motor skill. Then your cognitive abilities, which includes everything else, imagination, creativity, logic, computation, right? Pattern recognition, social and emotional skills, think about those, emotional intelligence, etc., right? Well, if we go back to the Industrial Revolution, in a sense, what machines did was exploit the comparative advantage they had in substituting for our physical abilities, right? So everything that required force or speed could be replaced and could be replaced quite easily with machines, right? Perhaps fine motor skill, not so much, and that's been one of those areas of technology where there have been a lot of investment. Recently, I will show you a picture of something that I thought was absolutely amazing. And I'm really happy and looking forward to have it somewhere in my house very soon. Right? So it really took over and substituted for humans in, for example, agriculture, industry, right? These are places where you really required lots of force, perhaps speed allowed you to increase productivity very quickly, right? But leaving, in a sense, everything that had to do with the cognitive area completely untouched, right? Still, if you go back and look at the era, right, there's these famous episodes of the Luddites, where the people getting displaced reacted towards the adoption of these new technologies, destroying them, creating all kinds of social unrest, right? And as previously mentioned, it took 60 years or 70 years for things to go back to normal. But once things went back to normal, well, of course, it will depend on how fast those machines displace humans and how fast we recover those people from this negative effect, right? And of course, the main issue will be how these machines destroy first their human capital, right? If you think about the Luddites, these were no low-skilled workers. They were skilled artisans who were being replaced by machines, right? So in a sense, that's also going to be happening a lot in the future, right? You're going to have people who have very specific, production-specific skills, which will be replaced, right? Of course, this damages their livelihood. It's very hard to move to some new sector in the economy. And so at the same time, you didn't see only disruption through technology. You saw disruption in terms of the types of jobs that you were doing and the types of organizational structures, right? So this is the famous factory scene in modern times by Chaplin, right? Kind of criticizing precisely the invention of the Ford system, right? Where work which used to be kind of very non-repetitive has become standardized to its minimum and can be easily repeated by one individual over and over. Of course, this has huge implications on your quality of life when you work, right? But this not only affected workers, it actually affects firms, right? Non-innovating firms will be taken out of the market, right? Which means that they will also lose their physical and financial capital, right? And of course, all employment related to these firms, right? And now I actually was reminded, and I will talk about this in a moment, that this doesn't only apply to individuals, to firms, it actually applies to countries, right? The whole competition among countries in the 18th, 17th, 19th century had to do to try to gain economic preeminence. And if we think about the future, as we just heard, in a sense, it will be concentrated, right? Economies of scale for these new technologies is going to be very, very, very strong. Now, so if you were in the 19th century, you may have been very worried about the future. Still, if we look at what happened, well, the expansion of the market for cognitive abilities was huge, right? Lots of demand for workers in the service sector, lots of demand for innovative and creative types of jobs, right? This generated all kinds of new occupations. It created more and better jobs, right? In general, people now work in jobs that are, we would find more satisfying than they used to be, right? We don't work down in a mine shaft for 30 hours straight, in danger, etc., right? Additionally, it generated more education, both because of demand, but also because institutions changed to allow people to access education and generated higher levels of income, right? And in some cases, at least, it allowed institutions to change, which allowed, for example, democracies to prosper, etc. Right? Which, of course, after 200 years, has resulted in less poverty and less disease around the world. And so if we think that that's linked to our welfare, well, what we can expect is really that somehow the last 200 years have been really incredible in terms of improving the lot of humankind, right? And to see this, I pictured here first the population of the world, and we see that clearly something happened around 1800, which really allowed population to explode, right? Which means that we're able to feed more people, we're able to allow them to survive, right? At the same time, if we look at income per capita, which is what we economists love to have as a measure of your material well-being, if you want, we see also that something changed, right? In general, the world became much wealthier, but at the same time, it really became much more unequal. And this is across regions in the world, right? And part of what we may be seeing here is the fact that some of these countries were able to do the Industrial Revolution, join the modern economy, while other regions in the world really lagged, stayed behind. And so I'm going to be telling a story that may be focused on this type of countries, right, where we're really worried about our current conditions and how they may change. But if you think about some developing country, right, they may not have even done industrialization. They may not have an industrial sector. This may not displace any of them. They may actually be in the agricultural sector living on a day-by-day basis, right? Which means that even though mechanization destroyed a lot of jobs in many places and concentrated wealth around the world in certain regions, and in principle we could actually have with that technology an improvement for everyone, it doesn't completely destroy everyone's job. You may still remain being just some kind of antiquated producer, right? We still have hunter-gatherers somewhere in the jungles of Brazil. So it may be that this is what the future may look like. So in principle, perhaps if you're the most advanced economy, you should not worry, right? We will generate more jobs, everything will look great. And if you look at other measures of well-being, if we look at how much leisure you get, the wealthier you get, the more productive you get, what you find is that you work less, even though, in a sense, you're becoming richer and richer around the world. So suggesting that perhaps development may actually be very good, right? The fact that we're not working as much may be very good, may be compensated by increases in technology. Right? Moreover, if you're like me and you're lazy and you like to enjoy your weekends, technology has really allowed us to have a lot of free time, right? And there's a lot of examples of how invention of certain types of appliances, for example, have huge impact on the free time and the labor force participation of women, etc. Here I took some pictures of what I know is the most modern washing machine. I didn't see any difference from the last 10 years. This is a current vacuum, right? That's my Internet of Things. I can make it work from my cell phone. It's amazing. And this is the one I want to have in my kitchen. That's the kitchen of the future. And if you were worried about dexterity, this looks like human hands and actually can do things that chefs are doing. And they are being programmed by chefs to do the dishes, right? And I don't know if we're going to share slides, but I have the link for all those kind of cute videos. It's just scaring and amazing at the same time, right? Because you can imagine that this will mean that restaurants may disappear, right? There's just going to be a kitchen. You say, I want this. Robot does it. Your dish is out. There's no cook, no dishwasher, no one of the sort. Right? And if we look at household chores and like how much time you spend working inside the household, which usually meant women, right? If in the US, what you find is that the more these appliances became available, more of these appliances are adopted by households, the number of hours that you spend doing those chores really dropped, right? Which means that really there's a lot of free time for you to enjoy, right? Be with your family, read a novel, go for walks, etc. So if you think about the effect of technology, there are like two types of effects on labor. One is the labor that gives me income, and one is all the labor that I don't want to do, but I have to do to survive day by day, right? And I think that perhaps this is the way we need to start thinking in the future, right? And so if you look at history, perhaps what you should end up saying is, OK, don't worry. Everything is going to be fine. We will create more interesting jobs, high quality jobs, and you will just train yourself. We will teach you to code, and perhaps we'll teach you how to create robots, right? Because remember, for example, the Luddites, they lost their job to the machines, but they had this dexterity. They knew how to do things. And so they become the makers of machines, right? Or the engineers that work on the machines when they get broken, right? So I wonder if the future really looks like the past. Is there something that may have changed, right? Are there any qualitative differences? And if those are there, what can be what's really behind this? And I think it has to do with the amount of machines and the amount of computing power we have, right? So if you look at data on the number of robots that are being installed and sold around the world, what we see is this dramatic increase in the number of robots per worker, right? And a lot of it, if you look at, these are the projections for basically in 10 years, the number of robots will have increased threefold, right, or twofold, threefold, right, in a decade, right? And if this goes at this pace, basically, we may have a really increase, perhaps ninefold in 20 years, right? And of course, the machines that we're getting out right now are not the same machines that were out there in 2008. These are much smarter. I will show you an example in a moment, right? Third, a lot of these robots are actually being produced in only 5 countries. So again, if you think about the Industrial Revolution, steam engines were the important thing. And that was only being produced first by the UK, then by Germany, France, right? And here we are already seeing who is going to be the big leader in providing robots for the rest of the world, right? China has a huge advantage, but not only producing them, it's also demanding them, right? So if we're worried, China needs to also worry about how the adoption of robots is going to change their social system. And perhaps that's why they care so much, because in the end, it's autocracy. And so we're always told you're willing to put up with an autocrat as long as he puts food on the table and things look better, right? So China may be really worried, and it may be really affecting their prospects, right? But this talks a lot about, first, international development, right? Usually, development has worked in the sense that wages go up in one place, we outsource to another place, we bring in development there, wages go up, it moves on to the next place. If now we can install robots anywhere, this will mean that development, or the process of development that way we've been taught or seen in the last 2 centuries, may change completely. Those ideas of Japan developing and then the rest of Asia basically outsourcing jobs from Japan and allowing them to develop may not work anymore. The second big, and I think this is the most important change, is the increase in computing power, right? Nowadays, and I could not find an actual statistic of the number of computers that we have in the world. But what we have clearly found is that between 1980 and 2010, the price of billions of computations per second has decreased by the order of 100 million, right? That is, now I can produce a lot of computations very cheaply. And I will show you in a moment with an example what this may mean, right? So I think that these are 2 really big issues. And this is not because the chip is smart suddenly. It's not like, it is indeed smarter, right? If you ever take a picture, after 1 second, it knows who is in the picture, right? So with specialized chips, we've done a lot of things that allow us to do many things much better. So let's go back to this comparison between humans and AI or machines, right? So we're usually told, OK, don't worry. It's about humans being creative. We're very social beings. But this also means that we have preferences, values, and culture, right? That's why if they send you to work in some other office in another city or perhaps in another country, things may not work out very nicely, right? Additionally, we are actually slow learners, right? So if you think that we're going to be moving into a society where we're constantly learning, well, even the ones that are all their life learning, we tend to become slow and slower with age, right? We need to rest, right? That's why we all watch YouTube videos during work. We're doing Facebook. We like to have fun. At the same time, we tend to get sick, depressed. We get bored if we have to do the same thing over and over, right? And we're very slow to adapt. If adapting was easy, I think a lot of problems would have been solved by now, right? At the same time, we have very limited knowledge, right? Each one of us is an expert in whatever they do, and that's kind of it. Right? And clearly, we cannot work 24/7. If we look at AI machines, they tend to be very specialized. Right? They can do mostly one thing, and I think this is something that has been overlooked. We've been worried about this AI that can do everything we do, right? But the fact that it can be specialized and that every job, if you think about economic development has become specializing and more specialized. Provisional labor has just become increasing. This means that we should be able to actually use machines that are ever more specialized. They tend to be, especially now, interconnected, right? So perhaps I have a problem with my iPhone. They learn about the problem, and then everyone's iPhone won't have that problem, right? So that creates a lot of benefits to the machine, right? Easily upgradable. My iPhone a week ago had no idea how to do emojis in SMS, and I don't know what else. Today it can do it. I still cannot do it, right? Slow adapting and slow learner, right? They're very fast learners. I will show you some graphs in a moment, right? But in principle, you can think of an iPhone before you put the operating system has no knowledge of anything. After a second or a minute, it can do everything you're programmed it to do. Right? It has no culture, no opinions, no preferences, at least if it's not trained by us, right? We know of the example of those bots, for example, on Twitter. I think Microsoft was the one that created this very politically incorrect bot, right? Which is basically because it's trained on humans, and so that may have driven it to be equally biased, etc. Right? And clearly, they can work 24/7 as long as they have a battery, right? Or they have electricity, which, in a sense, everything I'm telling you today will depend on how we deal with the energy crisis, right? But of course, AI can solve this crisis. Perhaps they will figure out how to do nuclear fusion because we couldn't do it. So will we go back to the future? Perhaps not, right? Because first, robots create robots, right? And I thought, like, I'm sure I cannot find an example of a factory of robots. Well, I actually did. And it's not a new factory. They've been doing this since the 1990s, right? So if you had the idea that humans will move and start working and creating the robots, that's not going to happen. Well, the other option was, OK, you will be an engineer and you will program robots. Well, now you have these really cool robots that anyone, a child, can program it to do the type of jobs that you will need in industry, right? This guy is programming the robot to do whatever it needs in less than 2 minutes. And you can change after it's done what it needs. You can move it somewhere else. In 2 seconds, it's going to be, again, doing whatever you tell it to do, right? So perhaps we won't be able to go to those kind of jobs, right? But OK, we may still be smart, right? And again, I think it's not because AIs are smart, right? So far, machines are not smart. They are not creative. They're not emotional, right? They don't know what love is. Today, I asked Siri, what is love? And it actually played me a song. So clearly, it doesn't really know. And since I don't have time, I'm not going to repeat it. And, right? So what we're told is that, OK, jobs that require specific human qualities are safe. Or think about being a musician or perhaps a health professional, right? That's one of those topics that's in the news all the time. You will need people to actually help you because we have a lot of people getting older. Perhaps you're going to be a poet or a writer, or if you do innovation, or if you're thinking outside the box, because those are things that AIs cannot do, right? So let me tell you the story about 2 algorithms. One is called Stockfish. The other one is AlphaGo Zero. Stockfish is an algorithm that was trained to play chess. And it used all history of chess known to man. It was programmed, and it keeps being updated and reprogrammed with many people collaborating. Right? And it was actually the world champion of chess many times in the last couple of years. One of the problems, besides that it takes a lot of work to actually make it play correctly, is that it requires a lot of computational resource. Right? If you've ever played chess, well, in the end, chess is the perfect game, and I like the fact that we brought back Herbert Simon. It's the perfect game, right? In a sense, there is no imperfect information. You know what the other one is seeing. Everyone sees everything. Everyone knows everything. And it's a finite game in a sense. So in principle, everyone should be able, just like in tic-tac-toe, after I put the first move, game should be over because we already know who won. But it's a very difficult game to figure out where it ends up. So you need a lot of computational resource. Well, that's the way it used to go. Now, the people from DeepMind at Google created this algorithm called AlphaGo Zero. And AlphaGo Zero is a general type of neural network with reinforced learning. Now, the interesting thing is that the theory about this has been around for a while. It's not like it was invented a year ago. But the resources to do this and the technology to actually be able to use these type of networks has changed dramatically in the last 5 years. So what did they do? AlphaGo Zero is an algorithm which requires no data, no prior knowledge of any kind of human experience, thought, anything like this. It just needs the rules of the game, right? And so I'm going to show you basically, this is the mix of two. One is, it used to be AlphaGo because it was playing Go, and AlphaZero, which was playing chess, and now AlphaGo Zero, which basically has been generalized to play any game. And if you're a social scientist, you know, and you've learned some game theory, you know that anything can be modeled as a game. So this is a very general machine. Right? And AlphaGo Zero taught itself to play and how to play this correctly. Right? With only 4 processors. And those 4 processors, of course, are not exactly the same processors we have. These are specifically designed for neural networks. But you could have done it with your laptop. And actually, if you Google afterwards, I invite you to go check. You can actually download the code and play it on your computer. Right? And it outperformed Stockfish in 4 hours. Right? So this thing, which had all our knowledge, all of us behind it rooting, this is what grandmasters used to train with, was outperformed by a machine that had no idea about what chess was 4 hours before. And here we have the evolution of learning to play Go. And here this is basically, you have a comparison with what's called the AlphaGo Lee algorithm, which was the one that beat and made the news a year ago. It beat the grandmaster of Go, I can't remember how many times. And then they had a second one, which also was more powerful. And what we see is that this one outperforms all of them. And I think the numbers were like 100 to 0. So basically, it's in less than 40 days. Right? Which I thought was amazing. Right? This is really, but at the same time, really scary. Right? Now, so I thought, can I give you an example of something that a machine can never do? Right? And so I thought, let me do something I cannot do. Let me write a more romantic poem. Right? This is clearly something that should be very specific to humans. Right? And why? Well, definitely we should be based on love. Right? It's one of our most essential feelings. It requires poetic aptitude, which, for example, I don't have. Right? Usually, it will involve falling in love, some heartbreak, and then being able to write. Right? So if there's something that a machine should not be able to do, is writing a poem, right? Especially not the most romantic poem, right? And so how would evolution or AI do it? And I think evolution actually helps us how to do it. So let's think how we could find the most romantic one-page poem, right? So let's put the rules of the game clear. Let's imagine we want a one-page 12-point Times New Roman font, single-spaced, 1 inch on every margin, because if you don't give these things, you know the student will just do 3 big letters and will say, that's my poem, right? So we will treat it like this. So this is approximately 25 characters, and we want it in English, right? So I thought, OK, can I program something to do this? And if you've studied any book on evolution, usually what you find is this example where monkeys, if they type on a typewriter, randomly they will write all of Shakespeare's oeuvre, right? So I thought, OK, let's see, what would we have? OK, if we just randomly put characters, right, we'll get a number of possible poems, which is just impossible, especially for me to do. Like, I'm a slow typer, so it took me like 2 minutes to randomly type one page. And so at most, I could write 27 million poems in 100 years. So in a sense, this would seem that it should be a safe thing. Well, then let's say that if you were able to create all these possibilities, you could just throw the garbage away, right? So you look at whatever doesn't have words, or it doesn't have sentences, or is not in English, right? And then quickly lower the number of potential poems that are there. And then you could rank between the least romantic and the most romantic. Since I like coding, and I do this every day, so I decided, OK, let's create some random poems, right? And I tweaked, of course. I cheated. So my first poem is just, and I don't think you can see it, but it's just random letters. But clearly, this would be one of the potential results. Click again. This page is full of English words. And my third try, whoa, two of Byron's most famous and best poems on one page, right? So it didn't do what it should be, because actually it gave me 2 poems. But in a sense, it shows you that you could actually generate the most romantic poem, even though the machine does not know love or romance, right? It doesn't really enjoy or appreciate the poem, right? So this means that even though the machine can create it, perhaps we still will have a role, right? First, we will provide the data for ranking, right? Somehow it has to figure out what's the most romantic, what's the least romantic. One way is, OK, you post them online, right, and let people put signs, ups, likes, Netflix for poems, right? Or you could perhaps look at who has rented out books of poems, right? And use that data to figure out what looks like the best poem. So notice, again, I'm hoping that we have at least this part. The problem is that once they learn enough, an algorithm will be able to do this. And after employing 100 of you to tell me what's the best or worst, the algorithm will actually find the best one, right? But we will remain the ultimate consumer. That algorithm, that computer, my Siri, has no idea what to do with this, right? It's a bunch of information that's completely useless, does not generate any utility to it. Right? So this brings us back to the advantages of AI and machines, right? Remember, they are interconnected. They are upgradable. They're replaceable, right? There's nothing any machine can do. I don't think there's going to be an attachment. My vacuum cleaner, once it's broke, it's going in the garbage, right? There is no training required, or perhaps training is actually very easy, right? And it can self-teach itself, right? There's no turnover. It's not going to complain because it doesn't like its boss. It doesn't quit and move into another factory. It will take away your intellectual property, right? In a sense, it's the perfect worker. And when I say I put this picture here, it doesn't have to be made out of anything material. It could be just an algorithm, right? So think about all the algorithms that are being used in the financial services sector. But if that's the case, and as I show you, and that's where like the importance of the number of computers and the power of computing, the cheap of computing power is, this means that anything in principle can be replaced by a machine. After thinking about this for a month and finding ever more examples of what machines can do, I really think that we need to start thinking again about our role in the production process, right? And so I found this quote from Yuval Noah Harari, which is a New York Times best-selling historian, who came up with this term of the useless class, right? And I think it says something very important, right? And he says, in the 21st century, we might witness the creation of a massive new unworking class, people devoid of any economic, political, or even artistic value, who contribute nothing to the prosperity of society, to the prosperity, power, and glory of society. This useless class will not be merely unemployed, it will be unemployable, right? the example with the poems, it was 2 lines of code. And I could, if I had spent a week, I could have done it actually much, much better, right? So it really opens up the question of what's our role if we cannot, and this may be the near future, we have no role in production, right? Which brings us back to the first graph of where income diverge among countries, right? First of all, every country will have, and every company will have the incentive to be the first, right? Because otherwise you get wiped out. But, and here I think the whole idea of devoid of value just because you're not part of the production process still reminds us a little bit of our own cultural point of view. Right? Perhaps people may have value even though they don't contribute to the production of society. Right? Then I found this quote from John Cryan, who's the CEO of Deutsche Bank. Right? And he says, we have to find new ways of employing people, and maybe people need to find new ways of spending their time. The truthful answer is we won't need as many people. And this brings me perhaps to one of the most important questions that I'm trying to think about is work central to human experience, right? If you go to the oldest paintings of humanity, it's showing us hunting, right? Or gathering, or, right? So it's kind of, working has been there with us since the dawn of the ages, right? So if we lose work, what can it be, right? And perhaps this brings us to the distinction between the professional and the amateur, right? And that's why I like the story, the example with the chess, right? AI is better at chess, and it's better at chess than many of us, right? And now I will think that AlphaGo Zero may be better than all of us, right? But we still continue to play, right? There is some value to playing chess against someone else. So even though an AI can make it better or can beat us anytime, we may still want to play. Right? Machines are stronger and faster, and they've been stronger and faster for over 100 years. But people still compete and train, and then they'll do weightlifting, and, right? Just for fun. Because we like leisure, we like consumption. So in a sense, the problem is between the split of production and our role in production versus our role in consumption. Right? And then, of course, it may mean that we may just do things for the sake of doing things, right? What the French called l'art pour l'art, right? I may just learn because I like learning, right? Or creating for just creating, right? I may be a really bad painter, but I still like to paint and sit down and do some scribbles on the page. Right? So it may be that we will be able to change, to first allow us to take part in this consumption, but also we have to, in a sense, change our culture where we don't do things because the market requires them of us, but we may be doing things because we want to do them. Right? And this raises the paradox of poverty in the midst of plenty. Right? If you take, and this is a famous phrase by Keynes, if you look at technological progress, in a sense, it should allow us, or like the future technology, it should allow us to solve lots of our problems today, right? Especially energy production, right? It should generally mean that we should have material abundance, right? It should free us from work. And in a sense, I always think about the first innovators. They were trying to I'm sure they were as lazy as I am. They want to get rid of stuff, right? Whenever you can create a machine to do your work, you want to do it, right? So we want leisure. We want to enjoy our free time. We want to enjoy being with friends and family. We want to enjoy traveling, right? But the question is, how can we allow people to take part in this abundance, right? It's clear that the owners of the machines will have, if not all, most of the wealth, unless you're one of those that are not even part of the economy in a sense, right? So this raises the issue of perhaps the need for redistribution, right? And so one of the proposals has been universal basic income. The interesting thing is that first, people who are not economists seem to misunderstand the effects of universal basic income on your incentives to work or not work. One of the reasons Milton Friedman liked it is because it doesn't affect your incentives in a sense. But interestingly, for example, in Finland, it failed because people felt that you were giving people money even though they didn't work, and that kind of created a kind of cultural shock. That was something that was not acceptable. Of course, it may just be because it wasn't really universal, right? It was just a selected group. Perhaps if we gave it to everyone, everyone would be like, okay, this is perfect, right? So just like because it didn't work in one country, in one small experiment in a small town, we shouldn't completely disregard it as a potential policy, right? The other one is social ownership, right? Which brings back all these questions about, should you be able to own an algorithm, right? 20 years ago, you could not own a mathematical formula. Imagine that if Pythagoras had decided to create a patent on his theorem, right? All kinds of people would not be able to use it. We've been changing this, right? So now you can actually create a patent on an algorithm, but algorithms are just math. So we may be able to, we should be talking about how we assign property of these. So what's the role of humans, right? It seems like, first, there should be data providers for the system, right? Without humans, we don't know how things work or what they like, et cetera. So, but this raises the question of ownership, right? Of privacy. If you need to know everything about me to be able to do these things, then perhaps you need to follow me everywhere, just like Siri does, right? Who will own that data, right? And this is really problematic because in a sense, it's not one piece of data. If I delete my account, it will have no effect on what Facebook knows. It's because it's really a social construct, right? It's more than the addition of the small parts. Right? All of us could actually move out of Facebook right now. Nothing would change. Facebook would still know a lot about humanity, in a sense. Right? The second role is clearly humans, consumers, right? Machines don't consume anything that we produce, in a sense. What will mean to be a productive member of society? And I think that's come back to one of the points raised in the main lecture. And it's, we do actually have this term, productive member of society, right? And we require, for example, people who have been in jail to become productive members of society. But if we can, neither one of us can be part of production, what does it mean to be a productive member of society, right? And of course, what gives life meaning, right? I have hard time thinking about this because in a sense, I'm doing what I like, right? Being an academic is a completely different type of job than being a 9-to-5 worker in a mine, right? It's much more interesting in the sense that I have a lot of freedom to do my own research, I interact with people, et cetera, right? So perhaps for me, I've always been exposed to this work and life kind of being the same thing, perhaps not the same thing, I don't know. But perhaps we need to think about these issues. Right? What's going to be the role of education? There's been a lot of talk about let's teach everyone to code. Right? And in a sense, the example I gave you would say, oh, yes, you need to know how to code because then you will have a job. But the problem is algorithms write code. Right? And they've been doing this for over 20 years. They're just getting better, and they will become better. Right? So what do we have to learn? What we want to teach our future generations, right? More importantly, why learn? Why teach, right? There's not going to be a reason, like a market reason. And this is something that actually comes up every semester when my students come to talk to me. They're all like, I want to do this with my life, but I will have to take a job in this sector of the economy because they pay well, etc. Right? So perhaps this will allow us to really think about how we can become happier. And that's kind of the question I wanted to leave you and hear your thoughts about.